Welcome to Intergalactic Relations, a University of Sussex podcast. On this season's podcast, we explore the liberal utopianism of Star Trek: The Next Generation. From the profound optimism of early seasons, mirroring the optimism at the end of the Cold War, to the pessimism that creeps into the show a few years later, as the inhuman results of shock therapy in the former Soviet Union and US misadventure in Somalia showed the limits of that post-Cold War order. We hope you'll learn a little about Star Trek and a little about international relations. Hello, I am Dr. Faiz Sheikh, lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex. I love Star Trek: The Next Generation, and I am embarrassed to be a fan of the character Worf in this episode. With me are my co-hosts, Dr. Sarah Bulmer, senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Exeter. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Faiz.
And Dr. Dan Watson, consultant researcher on civil wars and peace building. Hi, Dan.
Well, hello.
For this episode of the podcast, we watched Season 5, Episode 17, The Outcast. In this episode, nominally it's a rescue mission about some alien race that has lost a couple of their pilots in some mysterious area of space. They're asking for our protagonists to help rescue them. That's the backdrop, really. What it's actually about is the fact that these aliens are androgynous. At least that's how they're described in the show. They have no gender, no sex. That's ambiguous in this. The writers seem to confuse what those two things are. But the point is, there are no males, there are no females in this society. And as they work together on this rescue mission, the main player of the crew, Commander Riker, ends up falling in love, ? It's a Disney romance, 2 days and suddenly I want to get, fall in love, etc., etc. But he starts a romantic relationship with someone from this alien race who shouldn't do so, because in their culture, they're not meant to display male or female characteristics, and the fact that she is finding a male person in Commander Riker attractive means that she is deviant as perceived by her society. And the episode sort of has parallels to gay rights, sort of has parallels to transgenderism and the politics, contemporary politics around that, although this was aired in 1992. But it's messy, and we'll get into a bit more of what this episode might be about or might not be about. Sexuality is clearly an aspect of this as well, attraction, etc. That's more or less the episode. What am I missing? How it ends? Well, they rescue the lost pilots, excellent, and then Commander Riker and this new character, the androgynous lady, does that make sense? Soren, they fall in love, they admit they love each other, they have a lovely kiss, and then they're discovered, and Soren is taken away to be cured, quote unquote, of her deviancy. And this causes, another bit of courtroom drama, which is becoming common for the podcast. And in the end, Riker has to, make peace with the fact that this isn't going to happen. And Soren goes through whatever this, what would we call it? Gender-affirming treatment? It's so messed up. But something like this, and says, no, I was wrong before. I'm fixed now. I have no attraction to you. Bugger off. And Riker goes ahead and does that. Let's begin with discussing amongst ourselves the episode, what we found compelling, what we liked, what we didn't like, etc. We'll move on then to try and think about how the episode helps us understand politics today, some academic critique, applying our IR theories, or indeed seeing if the episode speaks to us, provides theory of its own to understand the world. And finally, we're going to talk about liberal utopia. The overarching premise of this season of the podcast is the idea that Star Trek: The Next Generation presents a liberal utopia for humanity, and we're going to think about what this episode tells us about that utopia. Okay, what did we want to start with?
God, where to start? I mean,
I think this is like porno track. Like it feels a little bit like one of those sort of late '90s kind of things you sometimes see in a like Shaving Ryan's Privates or something like that. Like that kind of that tier. There's a lot of like stuff that's a bit like I'm here to fix your shuttlecraft that goes on in this. And I found it hilarious.
I agree. It's got so much like techno porn in it. It's brilliant.
I think our listeners deserve some examples.
I know my way around a Starfleet shuttle.
This is brilliant.
The rate of absorption is linked to its size.
That needs to be more breathy.
Okay.
Rate of absorption.
The rate of absorption is linked to its size.
Yeah, I feel awful. Shooting photon pulses into the pocket.
We prefer to stay warm by sleeping with a friend.
Commander, tell me about your sexual organs.
Oh, that was genius. I wonder if a human and a Janai would be sexually compatible. You know, just wondering. Oh, God. Can you access the starboard manifold thrust?
I'll optimize the plasma flow. I find you attractive. I can't do it. I can't do it. I find you attractive.
There's a lot to be said for an experience that's primitive.
Oh, expertly done. We have many species of plant life. Perhaps you would like to inspect some of them?
Yes, I would. I've always been interested in exobotany.
And with that, I hope you all enjoyed those very real and very accurately portrayed lines, quotes from the episode we watched for today's podcast. If you haven't watched it, go and check it out. The Outcast. You will not be disappointed. My. Yes, Sarah, I noticed in the notes that you began the episode with some trepidation. You were not happy having to rewatch this. Whoa, what's that about?
This is just a bit terrible, isn't it? It's just quite terrible in many ways. I mean, the Janai as a race, like they just like wearing these like tunic baby suits, so they've all got bowl haircuts. Like it's just a bit grim. The storyline is just a completely confused hash up, which we can talk about later. Sort of extremely straight, slightly but also trans queer kind of mashup. But it's just not an epic episode, but it is very, very funny, and so I actually am glad I watched it again because it's not one that I would regularly watch. Definitely not. Hilarious.
Okay.
Absolutely hilarious.
I liked this episode. My memories of the episode are slightly different. I remembered this one fondly, and on the rewatch, I found it very cringe, but I took it to be one of those epic, moralizing episodes, in part, I guess, because of a speech that Soren, the member of the androgynous species who falls in love with Riker, I guess partly because of her big speech at the end. I don't know, I found it moving and all this. And then on the rewatch, that's probably the only thing that works in the episode. Probably everything else is terrible.
It is truly terrible. Go on, Dan.
I feel like it's quite difficult because talking about Soren, because she's clearly got feminine characteristics, and that is part of the basis of the relationship between Riker and her, even though it's supposed to be an androgynous, which sometimes indicates a society without any gender or sex, again, is a bit blurred on this kind of stuff. But I think there are times that we're going to end up referring to her as she, because that's how she's sort of subtly presented in the show.
I think at this point it makes sense to explain what we mean or what is meant by gender and what is meant by sex, because the episode is thoroughly confused on this point. And if we don't outline it now, it's only going to be more difficult to have a conversation about all this, right? So I don't know. Do you agree? Should we try this?
I'm very much entertained at the idea of a summary and a definition. So please go ahead.
You were entertained. Thank you, Sarah. Here I was hoping you to say, yes, let me start. Okay, fine, I'm going to start. What am I going to say? I'm going to say that sex, biology, sex, dangly parts. Which ones you got? Are they up there? Are they down there? That's sex. Hormones and thing. Gender. Society. Do you like pink? Do you like blue? Why do you like pink? Why do you like blue? Why have, in generations past, was pink a boy's colour and boy a girl's colour? Gender, constructed, fluid, and so on and so forth. Don't judge me too harshly. How did I do?
I mean, that's one reading of sex and gender. But
Damned with
feminist theory. Feminist theory has travelled quite some way with this. There are all different types of conceptualizations of gender, sex, sexuality, desire. Yeah, and we've even complicated, I say we, particular parts of feminist theory have even complicated that sex is separate from gender, and actually that gender is the thing that produces the idea of two naturally opposite sexes. So it's very complicated. It's very complicated.
Okay, I appreciate that, Sarah, but I tried to explain something to our listeners, and you complicated it once again.
I know, but we need to talk about heteronormativity. We need to talk about heteronormativity, and we can't talk about that without complicating these ideas.
So, what is heteronormativity?
Now you put me on the spot. Heteronormativity is the sort of assumption, the assumed, unquestioned reality that there are two binary opposite sexes, male, female, and that this is based on an assumed heterosexuality, i.e. they are attracted to each other, they have sex with each other, this is the natural order of things, and that things like masculinity and femininity are mapped onto those characteristics in the particular ways. And then within that, anyone that doesn't conform to that is somehow deviant. And so that's where you get ideas around, well, the pathologization of homosexuality, for example. And so anyone that doesn't fit into that. And we can see heteronormativity written into all our social structures, popular culture. So we'll talk about that in this. But it's actually just so rooted in so much of our way of organizing the world, politically, socially, domestically, and internationally, completely central to who we think we are. Yeah, how's that?
Nice. I'm convinced. Okay. If all that stands, let's talk a little bit about how the episode completely messes this up and would be confusing to anyone, let alone people versed in this theory or these theories. Because, I mean, I'll start with an example. Riker, our male human character, I should say, if these characters and names are in any way confusing, we have a 10-minute episode 0 that you can watch where we explain who each of these people are. Please do give that a listen. Familiarize yourself with the characters of the show, and we'll be using their names as we continue. Right. I'll begin with a little dialogue between Riker, the second in command of the ship, who falls in love with Soren, the alien lady, as it turns out. He says, without the battle of the sexes, you don't fight amongst yourselves. She says, just because we don't have gender doesn't mean we don't fight. And I'm like, well, hold on. Riker said sexes. You replied just because we don't have gender, but they're not the same thing. That doesn't make sense. Was that just me, or does that not make sense to others? Sarah,
I agree.
You think otherwise?
No, I just think the whole thing is totally confused because of the fundamental political problem they had of trying to hint at queer identities without actually doing that in 1992. So the whole thing is just a complete mashup of all sorts of stuff because the whole idea of Soren and the androgynous race is an allegory. It's an allegory for LGBTQ kind of rights and the struggles that were going on at the time. But they didn't want to have any queer characters. Or openly gay characters. And so you've got this totally bizarre, strange coming out as heterosexual, coming out as a woman, and then weird curative kind of gender conversion therapy thing at the end, and all of this is signaling to gay rights, but it just doesn't work at all. And that's one of the reasons why everything they say about sex, sexuality, gender, mating is just completely confusing. So no, I don't think it's you.
Yeah, the mating with husks stuff is kind of odd. But the way I read it is this seems to be like quite derivative of Ursula Le Guin's work on the Left Hand of Darkness, but this is kind of a sort of distorted simplification of some of the ideas that she was getting at there, that has been turned into like a moral fable that sort of doesn't really go anywhere. But that wasn't what Ursula Le Guin was doing. Hers was more a what-if experiment. What if society was not organised around a binary gender distinction? One of the things I like about The Left Hand of Darkness is that it focuses on basically two different continents in this world. So it starts off on the southern continent and goes to the north. And they're both very different societies. The northern one turns out to be like the southern one's regarded as being like a bit backwards, sort of like a neo-feudal society, whereas the northern society is meant to be the more kind of bureaucratic, rational society, which actually turns out to be a police state, and is very punitive towards the Jen Lei, the character from outside. And I don't see any of this nuance in this episode. This society is it's essentially like monochrome in how it comes across. And no societies really work that way. This is another, I think, it's a sort of deeper problem that Star Trek has when dropping in an alien race of some kind, that they're all taken to have these essential qualities and properties to them, and it really doesn't work in some cases. There's a lot that could have been played with here, but instead you've just got like I guess this. I don't know how I'd picture this society, what life would be like in. It would be a very sober place, very prescriptive.
Yeah.
It wouldn't seem to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Involving a lot of repression.
We talked about it in the previous episodes as well. The warrior race, as if all of Klingons are all the same. Yeah. The information broker race, the science race, the da-da-da. I will say that as much as that's a problem in The Next Generation, in Deep Space Nine spends a lot of time with the Klingons, who are, until now, a warrior race in Star Trek The Next Generation. And in Deep Space Nine, we learn a lot more about what are the mechanisms, including the violence, that happens within that society to ensure that the warriors stay on top and can define the way in which the politics of that society work. What happens to the scientists? What happens to the laborers? What happens if you don't make it as a warrior and you want to be a diplomat? Things like this. It's all quite well, I think, fleshed out in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So do check that out if you want to take some of these ideas further. But you mentioned monochrome, Dan. Let's talk a little bit about how they present, as in how the show, the writers, the costume department decided to present androgyny for us. Sarah, in your notes, I see that you are upset with the fact they've gone for just you look like a man if you're androgynous, and that's it.
Well, they've chosen all female actors. They all look like women. And then they're all in brown baby suits that are deeply unflattering, sort of hang off them, and they've all got these weird bowl haircuts. They've all got dark hair. They all look the same. It's kind of creepy.
It's a bit like Monty Python meets Galaxy Quest.
It gives me cult vibes, that's for sure.
It's like stripped of gender. They have no individuality.
Right. But they are...
What's that about?
They've taken women and coded them more masculine?
Yeah.
And so, as if being a woman is the problem. Which I guess is the theme of the show in this society.
Mm.
But yeah, I remember thinking on a rewatch that this would have been more transgressive, certainly, but also more coherent if the androgynous character was not clearly a woman in some prosthetics, and if it was a man, that Riker fell in love with someone who presented male. That, to me, would have been more interesting. I don't know. What else? What else do you want to say about this episode that we liked, that we didn't like? It was a porno at times. It was deeply frustrating at others.
I mean, it's depressing to see that this is what 3 or 4 centuries of feminist theory ends up with. I mean, they don't know what they're talking about. Beverly's never thought about being a woman. She doesn't know what that means. Yeah. But she's very clear that men don't paint their faces or their nails.
Yeah.
It's like, oh dear, Beverly. Riker can't explain anything. He starts going on about, like, girls are sugar and spice, boys are snails and puppy dog tails. Like, seriously? It's terrible. It's so terrible. But to be expected.
I think some of the stuff has aged badly, like the pronoun stuff when he's like, well, I can't refer to you as an it, because that would be rude. We would now use they, them. But yeah, that's aged.
For sure.
That's become a bit cringe, I think. Worf as well. Worf, as you alluded to at the start.
My gosh, Worf does not get a good showing in this episode. They're discussing our protagonists are all around a table playing a game of cards. They're clearly off duty, relaxing, and they're talking about, well, these flipping aliens are weird, aren't they? They ain't got no gender. And then Worf's like, yeah, flipping weird. I don't like it. And then everyone's like, why do you have such strong feelings about it, Worf? Firstly, Worf didn't start that conversation. Like, you began by saying, like, this is weird. Anyway, secondly, Worf, they take the time to dogpile him a little bit for his views, but his views are not good, so fair enough, I suppose. He thinks that women are weak. He thinks that... What else does he think?
He just thinks it's wrong. It's against nature. There should be males and there should be females, and the man should be the strong one. I mean, it's just like classic Worf, isn't it? Classic how they portray Klingon culture as this like patriarchal, stuck in, weird rituals and not the liberal future, is it? I mean, that's the whole point of that.
And by pointing and laughing at Worf, as they all kind of do, and they share their wry smiles about like, oh, he's a Worf so backwards. Yeah. They don't then reflect on how they're also pretty damn terrible.
Exactly.
On the same issues.
Exactly. So it's a really nice way to deflect and make the audience almost think, oh, these guys are really progressive, when actually what they're saying is pretty absolutely terrible as well. So, yeah. And the fact that Beverly's like, yeah, a long time ago, men used to think that women were inferior, but it hasn't been like that for a long time now. It's like, oh my God, I could like do you a critique of gender like in your life, Beverly. I'm watching it. Yeah. Terrible. Absolutely terrible.
Yes.
Terrible. Yeah. Although the one thing I do like about this episode is that Riker ends up, his sexual affairs, it ended badly. I think it's the only one that ends badly for a man in the whole thing. Whereas all the women, as I've gone on before, all the women, they have sex and it all goes wrong. But this time, it's Riker that's left apparently brokenhearted over someone he met for 2 days or whatever. Anyway, he's fine by next episode. So
they're always fine by next episode. That's the premise of the show. They always got to press the reset button at the end.
Totally fine.
But Geordie doesn't have success in any of his romantic endeavours.
No, but Geordie is like a bit misogynist and creepy.
Yeah. Yes, he is. I think we already discussed him.
Also, the other thing I was thinking about was that Star Trek tends to have, it's quite good at sex and flings and promiscuity. It's really not good at love. It likes to hint at these things, doesn't it? Like the simmering thing with Deanna Troi and Riker and Beverly and Picard. And
it's almost like a forbidden love.
It's always a forbidden love or an impossible love because you can't get past something. And it's interesting also that domesticity doesn't happen either. They don't get married and have children, and it's really quite interesting.
The social reproduction angle is kind of absent.
You're forgetting O'Brien and Keiko.
Oh God!
They get married. They have a little baby.
Yeah, okay, they're the only ones. None of the main characters, neither of those are main characters. The main characters have to remain single and career-focused. Beverly has a kid, but the only way that works is that the kid is basically a little Starfleet ensign. That's how that works.
Yeah.
and gifted and like weird. There's no.
Yeah.
So it is. It's an interesting universe. It is very heteronormative in a whole lot of ways, but in other ways, it's not. It's quite different.
What else is there to say?
The kiss in the garden made me feel queasy. That made me feel sick. Like, actually.
Why?
Why
is that?
I think it might just be that androgynous race. I just what they were wearing, I don't know. It's like the anti-sex. There's like nothing erotic about them at all.
But were you not also interested in exobotany, Sarah? Were you not
I really wasn't.
Curious about the colours of the flowers? And
as if. And then Riker going on about the type of woman he likes. Like, what lies? Riker likes any women. He likes anything that moves. There's no like... Oh, it was so cringy. The whole thing was, it's just a bit cringe. Just a cringe. And then, when he was saying about them having sex instead of the husk, and he was like, there's a lot to be said for an experience that's primitive. Like, oh, the whole episode is just gross. Totally gross.
Yeah, I think it's like there's a bit of a missed opportunity there. Like, if they maybe had refrained from using Riker, who was, admittedly the obvious person to thrust into a situation, if you will, but instead using a character that maybe doesn't get quite as much action as Riker, or someone who's a bit more reserved, and seeing how this was like a learning experience or something that unfolded something within them. Gross. You don't really get that. It's more just kind of a rock and a hard place with.
Yeah, it's totally gross. It's totally gross. And the other thing I noticed that I have a problem with is how phallocentric all of those sexual innuendos are. Which, again, not a surprise. We live in a very phallocentric kind of sexual culture. But, like, so very unimaginative in so many ways. So much cliches. And yet they could have done so many creative things with this whole idea of an androgynous race.
Yeah, it wants to be something transgressive. It wants to push the boundaries. It thinks it's maybe doing that and speaking something meaningful around gay rights, for example. But yeah, the language, the misunderstandings of key terminology, and the slip between different concepts by the writers make it such an artifact of its time. So it is hugely sexist and problematic, phallocentric, and all these ways that Star Trek tries to avoid, because part of its success is persuading you to, as the audience, persuading us as an audience today to imagine, oh yeah, this isn't us today. This is our future selves, and look how different we are and developed, etc. But in this episode, even though that's what they're trying to do, we're just reminded constantly, oh, they're just the same as we are now. Doesn't that suck?
Yeah. Then again, I do think it needs some credit. Because it does do some denaturalization of heterosexuality. It does do that. It just ultimately gets refolded back in to these things. But it does. I mean,
because of
bringing up pronouns in the early 90s, that's quite interesting. Getting people to go, oh yeah, language. We can't even we don't even have the language without gender. So it does do some sort of quite transgressive stuff, or at least disrupt some of that a little bit.
What disappoints, or what on reflection is disappointing us, is that any of this disruption in the narrative of the episode is in the service of heteronormativity.
Yes.
Because while it is potentially an allegory about coming out as gay, or having a discussion about pronouns and what it means to be transgender, it's not actually about that, because this person is coming out as a woman and coming out as
straight,
being hetero, which doesn't quite work. One last point I want to raise before we move on to talk about theory a bit more substantively and IR. The one thing I want to talk about is at the end, with what I called sarcastically gender-affirming care at the beginning, but what could also be called conversion therapy, in this sort of flipping pray the gay away nonsense. And there is this treatment at the end that they apply to Soren to quote unquote fix her. And that was also, there was something going on there. I don't know what it is, and I don't know how I feel about it. What did others think?
Well, I think it's designed to shock us, isn't it? It's designed to make us go, oh yeah, we have this about gay people. but look, it could happen to like straight people, and how ridiculous is that? So I mean, that's what it's trying to like win us over by making it about something that could happen to us, i.e. the assumed straight viewer. Bizarre. It's a bizarre mashup. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about
Unlike
it.
our world. No, I agree, I'm not sure. But unlike our world, this treatment works. Whereas what makes such things in our world so horrific is that these things are applied and people suffer so much, and it's not even a thing,
No.
But in this 24th century future, yes.
Well, but it might work to the extent that people repress it. I mean, so it's like, what do we mean by when we say worked?
Am I right in thinking that this society, the Genii, that they began sometime in the distant past as having two different sexes/genders, depending on the terminology they were used, that converged into one gender/sex that mates via husks?
Yeah, exactly right. Soren's describing their history and says that they did have two sexes, it led to a lot of conflict, and the species evolved. And now they live in harmony because they're androgynous and inseminate husks to make babies. Okay, let's move on now and talk a little bit about international relations theory, about whether these theoretical concepts that we have been talking about help us understand or analyze the world today through this episode, or whether the episode, in fact, does some of this analysis for itself. I'll kick us off by mentioning briefly the comments that my colleagues made when we watched this at the University of Sussex in a research seminar last academic year. I had 3 colleagues comment on this. Tanya Weiss, postgraduate researcher, wanted to pick up on how the episode reverses contemporary discourse, much as we've been talking about. It's not that coming out as queer is a bad thing, it's coming out as straight is the bad thing. And that, for her, was something worth reflecting on. She agreed with us that the episode completely fails to represent feminism and that the 24th century is still deeply sexist, and then drew parallels with contemporary Russia and its banning of gay propaganda, initially for children, I think in 2017, and then later for adults as well. And this notion of censorship and controlling people's sexuality was part of this alien species culture, it seems, and it also has its parallels in, for example, these Russian policies. For our second speaker, Dr. Amira Abdelhamid, she did her PhD at Sussex, as did Dan. We haven't mentioned this. Dan also has the Sussex connection. She wanted to pick up on the problem of language and how even discussing what you call someone who doesn't identify as male or female is problematic with the language we have, how we create new words to capture the so-called new reality, how gendered our language is, basically. And she wanted to discuss how homosexuality in our world has been historically treated as a disease and how that's clearly something that is ongoing in this 24th century society, except it's not homosexuality, it's heterosexuality that's the problem for these aliens. And finally, Dr. David Karp, a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations here at Sussex, highlighted what, in the end, the audience, if I recall correctly, ended up going with, which is the episode is not really about gender for him, it's about sexuality, because there was no imagining in both the way the humans depict gender and sex and the way that the Genii do. There was no indication that males could love males, that females can love females. It's, for him, about desire, which I think is something maybe we can pick up on. And then he raised the point, well, this alien species sees Soren as psychotic, and they think they're reacting compassionately to this. So normatively speaking, which means to say the way in which we intuitively think they are wrong, is we, the audience, that is that fair or not? How would we react if we thought our friends or loved ones were psychotic? I'm not sure. And finally, he picked up on Riker's actions at the end. I don't know if we mentioned this enough yet, but Riker, there's only about 5 minutes of this in the episode, but he decides he's going to stage a rescue and go down to the planet and try and save Soren before she gets her treatment. And he finds this reaction so paternalistic. He mentioned that there was maybe a colonial overtone here as well, where Riker had to impose his gender on a genderless society. And was there something there worth it? So those thrown into the mix to maybe give us something to start with. Where do we want to go from here?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on David's last point there. I mean, it did strike me there were some parallels between kind of the idea of intervention being there to save people from themselves. It's been cited during the War on Terror as being, if not cited, then was in the subcontext of the justifications for intervention, which was sort of uplifting societies with backward gender norms from the perspective of the West there, and I felt that this was, but again, it kind of came out in quite a confused way in this episode. I think that maybe this might have been them trying to shoehorn too much into it, but it ended up being a bit odd because, yeah, like as you mentioned earlier, Captain Picard gives like a nod and a wink, like, oh, we might be here for a little while, to basically signal to Riker, you can stage an intervention if you want. That doesn't really seem to be kind of how Picard operates, at least not much of the time, doing an unauthorized mission like that. This to me was slightly strange because it kind of speaks to a broader point of there being kind of an anti-liberatory sort of undertone to this episode. And that could be something that is quite dystopic, something that we might note later, which is that we think of the idea of a society transcending gender, but it ends up becoming actually a place where it's monolithic in terms of its gender relations. That ends up becoming very repressive and conservative. But in this case, the kind of the Starfleet intervention, it kind of just falls flat.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the audience. Am I not sure? I'm not sure how I felt. Certainly, is Riker doing the right thing, going in there Rambo style and extracting this poor person, saving her from her own people and culture? Yes, because, everything we've said about this gender affirming / flipping gay conversion therapy is meant to rub us the wrong way. So we're meant to be like, yeah, save her. Don't let this happen. But then, that same narrative was used to justify the invasion of Afghanistan. So that turned out famously well, didn't it, for everyone involved, especially the women. So I don't know what I'm meant to be thinking, but I think the show is meant to have us on Riker's side. I don't know. What do others think?
I think so. It's that 1990s kind of perspective that the liberal way and human rights and a very particular understanding of what that means that is supposedly universal and not culturally specific is a rationale for doing those things. And okay, so that works to some extent in the sense that Western states in particular often justify their actions in terms of human rights. Even if they might have other reasons for going as well, they will use that discourse and mobilise it to intervene, and that can be quite problematic, and as you pointed out, ends up creating all sorts of other harms. But then we can also critique the way that asylum claims on the basis of homophobia are often rejected. It's very difficult to actually prove that your life is at risk. So I think the points your colleagues were making about this being about sexuality and actually trying to think about how we think and theorise about sexuality in world politics is quite interesting, and desire, and how that links with identity, it links with practice, it links with just all these other things, it links with ideas of masculinity and femininity and the nation. So actually this episode is quite rich for starting to unpick some of those things, and then core sort of political questions. So do we, where is the primary boundary of community? Is it that we all have the state and we shouldn't intervene in other states? Or is it that, for example, if you're a member of the queer community, you are allied to the queer people in that other state, and that's your primary kind of allegiance or way to make your basis for your moral decisions? So it's all these questions about political community, who's in and who's out, and then how that affects the judgments that you make around the morals and the ethics and what you're going to do in the world. So I think, opens up a lot of that stuff, which is very live today. It was live in the 90s, it's live today, it will always be live. sex and sexuality are completely core to human societies and intersect with all these other registers of power.
No, I like it. Can we? I'm not well read on this, so I wonder if we could collectively try and explain to folks listening how might sexuality or desire help us explain international politics. I think on the face of it, some people will be like, "What? There's no, that's a private thing. Like that's me and like my household or something like this." But then to say that it can impact world politics could be quite a claim for some people. So I wonder if we can take them to that point a little bit. Can anyone feel like taking up the challenge?
It's everything, right? There's so many examples one could give about the way that it's working. But I suppose I would talk about what I work on, which is largely looking at militaries and military identities. And you only have to look at the history of many liberal militaries and the way they hunted down and persecuted gay people within their own ranks for decades and did all sorts of bizarre practices, would go around with UV light looking for semen stains, would send agent provocateurs to like gay bars to try and catch people. I mean, crazy stuff from one of the most supposedly serious state organs, right? That is acting in world politics, to see that they felt it was fundamental. Why? Because they have an idea of what a soldier is. It's an idea around masculinity and a certain type of heterosexuality. And that is then linked to the people that they are enacting this violence on. And so you talked about the justifications for Afghanistan. And post-colonial authors have pointed out the way that it's white men saving brown women from brown men. And that is also, okay, we're talking about gender, we're talking about race, but it's also intersected with sexuality. It's all... I don't think we can make such easy distinctions. So, I mean, yeah, so then you can start looking at that and you can look at different societies' understandings of what sexuality is and then how that impacts how they relate with other states, whether we should intervene or not, and all of this. So it's completely fundamental. It's completely fundamental.
I think when we're talking about gender and international relations, one of the reasons to do so is that it can help illuminate those areas that have been rendered invisible, including, for instance, in the global economy, the role of women's labour or exclusion from labour, education. These kinds of topics are the fact that they're not seen as being bread and butter or staple matters of international relations is all the more reason to study them further. But even within those bread and butter issues, as Sarah was just talking about, like let's take war for instance. There are so many different aspects in which war is gendered, but also has a set of gender relations as well as sex work and sex abuse that surrounds war, and it could arguably be said to be constitutive of what war is.
I think it's also interesting how sexuality and sex is linked to the primitive. So the Janai have evolved beyond it, and they talk a lot about, Riker actually talks about primitive sex being very pleasurable. And then, of course, you've got Worf and his comments about men and women, and he basically embodies this idea of being primitive. And of course, he's racialized as well, and that links to how we think about colonial, the colonial kind of narratives about savage races. Those are often associated with sexuality. Sexuality is seen as threatening, seen as something that can be unleashed and that needs to be controlled. And we see that in the way that women's sexuality has always been under scrutiny and tried to be policed, but also so-called deviant sexualities as well that are the targets of state oppression. And yet other forms of sex are just allowed to happen. So Dan, you talked about sex workers, and particularly around global South military bases. That's just kind of accepted. So quite a bit. What I want to say, I suppose, is that this is all very contextually specific, and there is no one way we can say, well, that sex means this, sexuality and world politics means this. It's actually looking at a really quite a complex, nuanced set of social and human relations.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to say that I guess it is quite difficult to do an analysis to this episode the way in which we've done to previous ones because it's so confused and confusing. There is plausibly a way to read this and intuit something around contemporary transgender politics, for example. Plausibly, but not really overtly on the page for us, because it's so confused that we'd have to fill in a lot of gaps to get there. It could plausibly be about and allow us to comment on sexuality, and probably that's the strongest one and the reason why we've gone there. It could plausibly be about homosexuality. It could plausibly be about a number of things, precisely because it's so confused itself. So I wonder if that's as much as we can do here. If you're interested in this, we will say that there's a significant literature in international relations on these related topics, one of which we'll recommend here is a classic by Cynthia Enlow, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases. Check that out to learn more about gender in international relations. All right. Let's move on then to the last segment of the episode and talk about what this says about liberal utopia and the liberal utopia of the show. As is becoming a running theme, I'm going to assume that you're in agreement with me that this isn't a positive spin on this supposedly liberal utopia, and it shows the limits, in some respects, of what liberal politics can offer to an emancipatory, sexually liberated society. I don't know. What do we think? And if we think that, why do we think that? Can we put some meat to that bone?
I don't think anyone comes across that well in this episode. The Federation end up looking quite inept or even impotent in the face of a society that's good at drawing boundaries and saying no. I'm trying to make a point here about, I guess, like sovereignty and stuff. Like, I mean, this is sort of one of those moments where like the sovereignty can kind of help shield sort of abusive practices, but also can prevent social re-engineering.
It's a sticky issue. Like, I don't want to draw parallels to Xinjiang, but like, hey, we're China, we're fucking up our own people, re-educating them, giving them this procedure to make them more Chinese and make them normal. And the international community might be like Riker and be like, what the hell, man? You can't do this stuff. They're already normal, as Riker says in the episode regarding Soren. But what? What are you going to do about it? We're a sovereign nation, in China's example. We are a independent planet in the show. They're not part of the Federation. They haven't signed up to these ideals. So where does that leave us, and where are we normatively? In our contemporary world, of course, I'll say of course, in our contemporary world, we are not sympathetic to that Chinese mission of quote-unquote normalizing the minority. So why do we have any sympathy for it in the episode? Do we have any sympathy for it in the episode? I don't know.
I think part of this, to me, I'm curious about whether or not Starfleet actually have progressive kind of gender laws and norms inscribed in their own procedures. I mean, they might do, but I think it's more asserted rather than demonstrated.
Sarah, not a utopia.
No, definitely not a utopia, because it's just so unimaginative. But I think it does tell us something interesting about utopia, creating utopias and new ways of being, which is that in this episode, you can see clearly how in trying to transcend certain kind of assumptions and ways of being, they end up reinscribing them. So to try and imagine this alternative vision and this androgynous race, the writers couldn't do it without using the resources of our current condition, right? So I think there's something very interesting to think about there in terms of what is the potential for utopia, because we are always coming from somewhere. We're always developing our ideas in a situated way from where we currently are. I don't think having a radical break is necessarily that possible. So where do we build our imaginaries from, I guess, is the question that it leaves me with. And my answer to that would be that it comes from the practice of those groups that are living otherwise, that's where we find resources for utopia. We don't find them, I would argue, in the mainstream cultural resources that we have. We have to look at ways of being and living otherwise to then use those to disrupt these logics and rationales and ideas that we have. So I'm quite interested in community and relationships and people and place in a very situated way. Praxis, I guess, and theorizing from that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what's happened to an extent with a lot of writing in Star Trek, and this applies not just to some of the alien races we've discussed, but to the Federation more broadly, is that it's almost like a funnel, but like the wrong way around, where society gets less diverse as the central parts of an organisation crystallise. So Starfleet ends up becoming, from all the whole diversity of human experience, ends up like there is quite a sort of conformist kind of streak running throughout the show. How the ship's organised, how life on the ships is organised. People are actually generally very similar. Someone like Worf sticks out because he's an outsider, but otherwise you can kind of tell, like, everyone. It's almost like everyone's coming from the same city or the same place in terms of how they kind of express themselves. And I think that what this could have done, this episode, if it wanted to potentially touch on some of the more positive and utopian themes, is try to flip that funnel around and bring out some of those more diverse experiences.
But then we have to also question what is diverse inherently good? So what's the basis through which we kind of make these judgments about what a utopia would need to be? And so, I mean, it's diverse to have it's diverse to have lots of homophobes in the world, as well as lots of people who are part of that queer community. But is that inherently good? Do we not want a set of shared understandings? Are we not always at war with this thing because we're social beings? So we're always seeking to be the fullest expression of ourselves, but we're always in community with others, and to understand ourselves. And Judith Butler writes about this, doesn't she? To understand oneself, you have to talk about norms and link with the other. That's how we know, who we are as who we're not. And so isn't this just, maybe this is just the human condition, isn't it? I mean, I'm not sure there is a simple prescription, if you like. So again, for me, it's practice, and for me, it'd be a question of the ethical relation to the other, or the non-violent or less violent way of engaging. I don't know. Tricky.
I was going to say, I think the way the sort of the liberal utopian answer would be like, well, all voices are encouraged so long as there's tolerance between them and they don't try and negate each other. But I think some of the things that you were just mentioning there suggest that in practice it's not likely to work out that way.
I like myself as somewhat of a communitarian, and I've written about liberal individualism as a universal construct, which I think the show inherits. It can imagine a utopia and a global society where the understanding of what it means to be a person has crystallized and is defined by something that we can list. Tolerance and individuality and self-actualizing in this way. And those things were theorized in large part by Northern Europeans, imagined to be applicable to all of humanity. And since we figured it out, guys, we know what it is to be human. We've thought about it. And guess what? All you fuckers in Africa, you're doing it wrong. So we're going to come and teach you how to be human. Get ready to be colonized, baby. Yeah, this understanding of liberal individualism and universalism is for me, so clearly linked to historical and contemporary violence world over that it cannot be a utopia. And this is my fundamental divergence with Star Trek. As much as I love it and love the idea that ours a more peaceable world, theirs a more peaceable universe, should Picard and his liberal warrior team, achieve their objectives and do the thing. This is one episode, as it are definitely episodes with Ro that come later, and there are many dotted around where you begin to think, as we have done on the podcast so far, ooh, maybe not. But then what is, quote unquote, the utopia? What is a more, shall we say, just future for humanity? And like Sarah, I go to something like lived experience and looking at minority practices and figuring out from them how they do things. It's telling that the show needed to imagine, or needed to, because that's a staple of both Star Trek and science fiction in general, to make allegories with using some alien species, something far removed from us, to create distance between us and the issue, and then reflect on that issue and say, like, ooh, maybe we're not doing things right. Famously, the 60s Star Trek had a race of people with who were white and black. Literally, their face, one half of the face was black, one half of the face was white. The other species, the other race on this planet, were exactly the same, but the white and black were inverted, and they completely hated each other because they were the wrong colors. And it put distance between the racism of our period, of our time period, and the racism that these crazy alien species were displaying towards each other. And it made us think, like, oh damn, if it's silly for them to be upset and commit violence against each other based on their skin color, then it's probably wrong for us to do the same thing. So that is a staple of sci-fi, but we have non-gender conforming communities here in our current period, and the ways in which they live, the fears that they have, the strategies for surviving and loving and living, that could have been resources for this episode to better articulate what it was trying to do. In a way, they were doing what we can critique liberal theorists in Northern Europe as doing, which is sitting down at a desk and imagining a humanity or an alien species and saying, well, based on my imagination, this is how it's going to go. So that's how it is. Peace.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, to return to the gendered question and how important feminist theory has been, feminist critiques of the liberal individual have done so much work in terms of denaturalizing that very idea, which is so embedded in our Western kind of culture that we don't even see it as an idea. But humans are not individuals. We are connected through interdependence and care. That's just a fact. And so this idea of the individual has always just been a complete fantasy. And then we've built all these like mechanisms and things. And arguably those have been built based on a male experience who were typically not directly involved in that care, or, they like to forget that they were children once and that caring is something, that they are vulnerable. And it's, so the gender question can also shed light on all of these such more fundamental kind of ideas, which are also inherently about colonial power and about violence. Because there was often a feminization of the so-called colonial races, right? So this is all just shot through with these power relations and this violence. And then thinking about, you talked about looking at gender marginalized or minority gendered and sexual cultures now for resources. Absolutely. So one of the things that I found so inspiring in looking at queer theory and the work done by lesbian and gay scholars and all of that huge sort of canon work is the way that, given the AIDS crisis, given the homophobia, the way that they built community, many of them managed to build communities and alternative ways of living, alternative forms of kinship outside of the heteropatriarchal domestic, nuclear family, is just really inspiring because it's about what's possible. So absolutely, Faiz, there's just so much that's already happening, and it's not drawn upon to imagine different ways. And these people are really doing it, responding it from real kind of contexts. Yeah, so I agree.
Which can take us all the way back to Ursula Le Guin, who also does it really well. So this similar themes that the episode tries to address. We've talked about the ways it maybe falls flat. Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness novel maybe does imagine such a society in a much more holistic and maybe satisfying way.
Do you know the other thing that I don't like? I'm just going to put this in as well. So we're talking a lot about it in terms of like the heterosexual majority, the like dominant group, and then these sort of minorities. But actually, even within these dominant ideas, there's always gradations between them. So you can be a heterosexual woman, but like the childless cat lady, you're right on the periphery of that heteronormative ideal. So you might well fit into it in some ways, but in other ways, it's used against you. And I think that's That's also the case with all of these ideas. Masculinity is another one. Whiteness. Are you white enough? You know, like there's all these like graduations even within these kind of dominant hegemonic kind of ideas. So again, the episode could have played more with that instead of having these sort of weird binaries going on all the time. Could have looked in a much more subtle and nuanced way. Yeah.
I don't want to crap on Star Trek too much, so I will say this, that I'd much rather have a society of young boys looking up to Patrick Stewart's Picard than I would looking up to flipping Andrew Tate.
Yep.
So, you know, there are gradations, and there's gradations here in the critique we're making Star Trek. So there we go. All right. Thanks for sticking with us today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Faiz.
And see you next time, everyone, where we will be watching Borg, which is another episode in season 5, episode 23. If you want to watch along with us, we will be going back and looking again at the Borg, who we saw in our second episode. And this time looking at maybe themes of maybe genocide, because that episode's dark. We'll see what we get to discuss in that episode, which comes out in 2 weeks' time. All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for listening to Intergalactic Relations. This podcast is made possible by the International Relations Department of the University of Sussex. Please subscribe to keep up with the latest episodes.